the Nonprofit Podcast, powered by DonorBucks.
Ever found yourself staring at a blank screen, grappling with the daunting task of crafting a fundraising appeal? You want it to hit the mark, compelling, sincere, impactful. But here's the catch. It also needs to be respectful, sensitive, and empathetic to the community that you serve. It's a dilemma many of us face in the nonprofit sector, how to strike that delicate balance between fundraising effectiveness and ethical storytelling. Whether you are a small grassroots organization or a larger established nonprofit, finding this balance is absolutely crucial. Welcome to the Nonprofit Podcast. I'm Jena, Education and Community Engagement Manager here at DonorBucks. We're here each week with practical actions you can use today to increase donations and take your nonprofit to the next level tomorrow. And joining us today is Maria Bryan, Director of Storytelling at Rustic Roots Creative and founder of Maria Bryan Creative, where she's the host of the When Bearing Witness podcast. Maria's insights into trauma-informed storytelling are going to shed some much-needed light on how we can create fundraising appeals that are not only effective, but also ethical and empathetic. Maria, thanks for being here with us today.
Jena, this is such a joy. Thank you for having me on.
I am so excited to have you here. I am such a fan of your podcast. I have learned so much from you in such a short amount of time. And your journey in trauma-informed storytelling offers a really unique perspective, I think, into the power of narrative within nonprofits. This has become such a big topic. So before we dive in, can you share a little bit about your experience with trauma-informed storytelling and its significance in the nonprofit sector? How did you get involved in this area, and what have you learned along the way?
You know, a lot of folks that are really focusing on trauma-informed ethical storytelling have some really big moment where they realize they were doing it all wrong. I actually have a little bit of a different journey. I have been in the nonprofit marketing space my whole career, and I started my consultancy in 2019. And much of what I do is support organizations with their storytelling and messaging, and I do a lot of training in that context. And in 2022, I was just doing a storytelling webinar, and I had a participant ask me about trauma-informed storytelling and how that works into my framework. That was my moment. That's when everything changed for me. Not just that question, but when I went to do a little bit of research so I'd have a better answer than what I just kind of just tried to answer with a lot of humility, I found very, very little out there really connecting the dots between trauma-informed care and specifically nonprofit storytelling. There's a little bit with journalists, which I'm thrilled, and marketing generally, but really specific to the nonprofit sector, I saw so little, which was disheartening because we are solving the world's biggest problems. People are coming to our door in a great deal of pain and having experienced trauma, and marketers don't have, and fundraisers don't necessarily have that social work background. So I essentially shut down my services and focused on learning about what it means to be trauma-informed and how we can be trauma-informed storytellers. And that brings us here today.
I really appreciate how you said the aha moment you found often comes from people realizing that they're doing it all wrong, and that you were perhaps included in that. And you're right. How do you know if you're doing it wrong unless someone asks you about it or someone's calling you out, especially if there are so few resources to tell you to do otherwise, right? As marketers, as fundraisers, we're so hyper-focused on the result. I think that it can be such a real challenge. And wondering if you could shed a little bit more light on what specific elements or tactics make a fundraising appeal, or even marketing in general, perhaps unethical, those oh no moments, again, how these practices can ultimately undermine the trust and credibility of the work that you're doing through your nonprofit.
Right. Okay, I love this question, and I'm going to give you an answer that you're not going to like. And that is, it's not black and white. There's no checklist. It changes. What's okay one day, what's appropriate language one day changes. But also more than anything, there is so much nuance and multiple truths when it comes specifically to trauma-informed storytelling. And so that's why I don't say that as nonprofit marketers, we have to promise to do no harm or we need to hold safe spaces, because we're human and we can't make those promises. So I just want to start, I will give tactics, I promise, Jena. But I do want to start by saying what we can do as humans is do our best to promote safety during the story gathering process and the storytelling process, and do our best to resist harm. And a lot of that is just being very open-hearted and open-minded to get feedback. Listen to your program staff. It's really hard. And I have so many anecdotes of when I worked as a nonprofit marketer, how I would feel lashed out by program staff that didn't like my campaign names, or I was publishing stories without them being reviewed, or changing language. So it was maybe, to me, felt more articulate, but really took away the voice of the folks that I was interviewing. So for some, it will be you have someone who will be telling you, maybe a program staff, maybe your community, and that will be your aha moment. When I still train generally on storytelling and marketing, I'll tag on trauma-informed storytelling. So some people might have the same journey that I had, where they just didn't think about it before. And they're like, and then they start kind of thinking about it and going on that journey, on their own. So really, no one chooses trauma. And when people have experienced trauma, they have lost all sense of control and feeling safe. So what guides me to be trauma-informed storytelling is to provide as much safety and agency as possible during the full process. And again, this can be very nuanced, because safety and agency for one particular story owner might not be safety and agency for audience members, right? This is where we get into a nuance. A story owner can choose to tell their story fully, and it's messy and it's painful and it's violent. But then you as a storyteller have to make those choices on how you're going to relay that message in a way that's trauma-informed for your audience. So what I would say first is to sit down with your leadership and really know and put on paper what your values are going to be as a storyteller. Are we going to prioritize consent, and what exactly is that going to look like? Is that just immediate consent form, or is it going to be an in-depth conversation? Is it culturally appropriate, language appropriate? That's, I think, one of the first things that we should be doing, is making sure that story owners have full consent. How are you involving other staff, those fierce advocates, the program staff? How are you building bridges and bringing them in to the storytelling process, not just to refer folks, but to maybe sit in on the interview, to be part of the review process? And then when it goes out, when your stories go out, if you choose to tell these really painful stories, which is okay. I'm not saying let's just write stories that are rainbows and butterflies. Some of our stories are going to have pain. But there's two things. One, you have choice on how much details that you're going to give that are maybe irrelevant for your audience. Your story owner can tell as much details as they want, but then you have a choice as a storyteller on which details that you're going to choose. And also, I'm hoping that we're telling transformative, strengths-based stories. And if that's the case, you can still include the pain and the trauma in the story, but you choose how much of that story is the pain and how much of that story is the journey, and how much of that story are you giving agency to the community and to the person, instead of, we're swooping in and saving them, which is tricky. It's not black and white. So that's where you have choices too, is how you frame the story, how you frame the pain. And also, giving those content warnings. Let your audience make decisions. You don't have to make all the decisions for them. Like, we don't want to have anything that might rattle them, but just give them that choice. We're going to be talking about violence. We're going to be talking about sexual violence. We're going to be talking about incarceration, whatever that may be. And if you don't have capacity, we want you to know, what this story is. So I'll stop there for a moment because that's a lot. But I just want to highlight that we can't promise safety and to do no harm. But also there are so many touch points in the storytelling process where we can make choices.
I think you have made such an important point there. Even if you've gotten all of that consent and they shared their whole story with you, doesn't mean that you should be sharing that entire story with your community, right? And I think that's where sometimes it can get lost. But how do you establish that ethical appeal from an exploitative run, right? You mentioned that crafting those appeals is not only about avoiding harm, but uplifting and empowering. And that should be at the forefront.
Yeah, so I'll give a few examples of how we can do things differently. And I give these examples with a great deal of grace, because if you're hearing this and you're like, oh no, that's what we do, just know that this is a journey. We're all on this journey together. But if you are just grabbing someone who's currently in service and not really giving them space to decide whether or not they're ready, and I've had those experiences where this person who was supposed to show up for that interview couldn't make it, and the whole crew's here, so you just grab someone else. So I think when it comes to the consent process, really truly allowing for a lot of space and not just grabbing someone. I also, low-hanging fruit is always going to be current patients, current clients, current program beneficiaries. But the problem with that is they're probably still in the thick of a very painful and traumatic season. So I encourage you to try to find folks who are further along in their journey. Maybe they've been with you for quite some time. Maybe they're alumni of your program. It just helps to ensure that there's been some space for healing and a little bit of space for consent. One of the most, I think, unethical and untrauma-informed kind of storytelling is when you tell the story of someone who's right in the middle of their journey. So Susan is staying in our shelter. She's a single mom. All her stuff are in garbage bags. And just this doom. And then ending the story really there with the call to action: if you donate, you will help get Susan off her feet. This is a storytelling that we've been doing in the nonprofit space for a very, very long time. There's no transformation there. You're evoking a whole bunch of saviorism from your audience, right? You can save Susan by donating. And how can we do that differently? Tell the story of someone, and it might be a messy story. It doesn't have to be a perfect transformation. But maybe instead the story is about how Susan, for the first time in a very long time, had a good meal, a roof over her and her child's head, and felt loved and heard. And empower that person, give them, the agency to tell their story, bring in the context, whatever the systematic things in place that brought her there. And I think that does a lot of justice to her story too. And then the call to action is, when you support our shelter, you help folks to have a second chance, or to have that safe night, not making it about saviorism, but more about evoking empathy, right? This could be my mother, this could be my neighbor, this could be me. If somehow you can work the story with empathy being at the heart instead of false urgency. Also, when you're working with very, very vulnerable folks, I think even today we forget how important it is to tell anonymous stories, to remove names, to be very careful with pictures, right? You can put them in a great deal of harm by showing who they are. I think that the choices we have when it comes to fundraising appeals, whose story are you going to tell, and are they really truly ready to tell their story? And also the choices on what part of their story you're telling and how you're framing it. Is this a strengths-based story, or is it just a story of doomism? And then what's that call to action? And can you be really careful with your call to action so that your donors do feel like they're part of your community and that their support is making the world a better place, but they are not single-handedly turning lives around through their donations?
Yeah. I think that there's that right balance between that storytelling that resonates with your donors, that's going to move them into action, and then honoring the dignity and the experiences of your beneficiaries, right? You mentioned something that really struck a chord with me, is all these kind of doom, false urgency posts, and we see them, we do, and it feels icky to me. It feels exploitative in a lot of ways, and it doesn't feel authentic even. So relating back to finding that balance, how do we hold the attention in a world full of shocking images and appalling situations when they come across our timelines every day, right? People can become desensitized in a lot of ways, but we still need to capture the attention of the people who we know can care and can help us with our mission. So how do you do that?
Right. I'm going to kind of do like micro and macro. People do love hearing positive stories. And the last thing I want is for people to like, Maria, we don't have positive stories. We're working with people who are in extreme dire, in hospice or substance use disorders. So for those of you, I get it. And I'm not trying to paint a picture of like, let's just all tell positive stories. But I do think that we can choose to find the transformation and to talk about transformation. So we do have choices on whether we are going to show people in their most dire situations and really kind of twist the knife in that. But I think we take for granted how much people need to hear those transformation stories and those positive stories. So test it. I mean, I don't think test by creating unethical stories, but see how it goes to really tell those really positive stories or the transformation stories. Find those little micro transformations and see how they go. Two, if you are concerned about telling a compelling story because you feel for ethical reasons, trauma-informed reasons, or maybe you just don't know the stories to tell, that they're not going to land, take advantage of tools that are evidence-based to be really powerful. Video storytelling being one of them. I mean, we know that having visuals is so supportive of people retaining information. And videos are just so powerful because you're using so many senses to consume a story. So think about maybe investing in a trauma-informed and ethical, but video story and integrating video more, because that's going to break through the noise better than maybe if you're just feeling like your ethical stories are ethical, but they're boring. Bring in ways to make them more engaging that way. And also you can tell there are more stories than just your beneficiaries. Tell those volunteer stories, tell those board stories. When I challenge folks to tell the story of a donor or a volunteer, they go to telling the beneficiary story. And I'm like, no, what life-changing event has happened with a volunteer? For me, I know growing up in New York City in the 80s and 90s, I have memories of with my father going down to the Bowery Mission and serving the community there, and how that has put me on a path of service. I also have those moments of learning about an issue I never knew before, and that completely changing my life. So I have stories as a donor, I have stories as a volunteer, and so do your donors and your volunteers. So find those powerful stories and tell them as well. People do want to be uplifted through your storytelling.
Yeah, don't forget about your other supporter. This is marketing gold, first of all, and whether that moves people to donate or to donate their time, that's a win. And I think that was the next question on my mind is, to use video in a format where you're not exposing the people or the communities that you're serving, it's tricky. Something that we did at the shelter was when we were preparing a room for a family, we'd always make up the bed really nice and put welcome baskets and hang photos and really try to make it cozy. And we would take videos like, all right, this room is ready. Here are all the cozy things that we're putting in. If you can donate a basket like this helps each family feel welcome and warm. And I found that those were easy to do. It's, something that we did every week was set up those rooms, but it resonated pretty well, right? Because they're seeing their dollars at work. They're seeing everything that they give go into a space that feels safe and welcoming. And I found that to be really effective too.
Jena, I love that example so much because talk about getting people's senses going. They can almost smell the candle. They can see this cozy room and you feel oh, I get it. I get what they do. And you can choose between sitting someone down to tell their story, which, there's room for stories of real people, but it's still a very powerful story to show these cozy rooms and to bring staff in and say, this is kind of back end what we're doing. I love, love, love that example.
One last question for you. Actually, I have a couple more. How do organizations best handle criticism from supporters or beneficiary communities and they have not done it well? First of all, how do you reflect on that? And then how do you frame a sincere apology for not doing it right?
Okay. I'm so glad you brought up this question because this is what I mean by you can't promise safety and no harm. And if you do, that moment's going to destroy you. It will destroy you. So when you decide, listen, I am going to do the best I can to promote safety and resist harm, knowing that harm will take place, what grace there is in that. So first, let's all know we have done harm, we will do harm. And if that's going to be your mantra for today, you have done harm, you will do harm. And that doesn't mean that we can't repair harm. So let's just sit in our humanness. And we all have our biases. We all have our own worldviews. And so let's start with that. Now, you have a community member that might be offended by a story that you told. One of the first things that you can do, if possible, is to actually not respond right away, to pause. There's so much strength in pausing. First of all, when you pause, you're not going to jump to being defensive, but you're also going to be able to have some space to look at the big picture a little bit more. They could be 100% right, or they could just have an opinion, have had a hard day and had an opinion. So what if it is something where you're a speaker and it's someone in the room, you can't really pause. But you might say that is really great feedback and I appreciate it. And I just need a moment to let's circle back on this. Anywhere where you can build in true pause and not just put it on the back burner, right? But let's say that you got an email or a phone call. Pausing allows you to research. Can you talk to other people with the same lived experiences? Not just one, just so you can kind of get the aha, I'm right. But really take some time to see, okay, maybe we use language that wasn't appropriate. I think a lot of it ends up having to do with language. And from there is the apology. And so apology with added defense is not an apology. So to own it, to fully own it and to echo back what they are saying. So we used a term, I apologize for using a term and not I didn't know, but not even I didn't know better or my boss told me to. We used something that was offensive and it made you feel small, offended, and you weren't heard. And I just want you to know that we see that. And the next thing is what is next, what we call the repair plan. And that can be taking the post down. It can be just having this one-on-one conversation with them. In some situations, it might be a statement. It doesn't always have to be that, though. It can be just taking something down and having that that one-on-one apology. But the person you harmed, bring them into that repair plan. What would make you feel like this apology is received? What changes can we make? And if it's a matter of changes, update them. Hey, by the way, like a few weeks later, we got together and we put together this consent process, or we created a language guide, or we've brought in people with lived experiences into the review process, and let that person know, that family, that community know the actions that you are taking. When someone tells you that you have done something harmful, it can be very dysregulating for your nervous system. So I also encourage you in that pause and also afterwards, take deep breaths, like whatever helps you to regulate, right? So you can get back into work. So taking deep breaths, journaling, talking to someone that you love and trust, where you can just be totally transparent with how icky this felt, I think is going to be supportive of you to get back in there and keep doing your world-changing job.
Okay, one more for you. What is one practical step or action that our listeners can take right away to ensure that they are on the right path to having fundraising appeals that are ethical, empathetic, and trauma-informed?
I say the first thing that you can do is sit down with your leadership and put together a storytelling guidance document. You know, when social media first came out, we all did this because it was the wild, wild west. We were freaking out. And so we're making decisions like, as an organization, this is the review process. These are the kinds of things we're going to post. No problem. These are the things that need a little bit more review. And this is like the red light. Absolutely don't post this. So many of you actually likely have some kind of guide like this in a different context. Do this for the story gathering and telling process. And it's going to outline, this is the consent process. This is how we're bringing in program staff. This is the review process. This is the story retraction process if somebody changes their mind, and then maybe the harm repair plan. And so that is just going to give you this guidance for you as a fundraiser or marketer to follow. But if the board member comes in and says, hey, I think we should tell this story, and you're like, ooh, that doesn't feel good, I don't know what to say, you don't have to come to them with your own ethical values. You can say, actually, we have this storytelling guide, and this kind of goes against what we have outlined. So as a start, put that together, put your workflows, make sure your values in there, and get the buy-in from leadership. So you're not trying to do this in a silo.
I think that it's so evident that ethical storytelling holds such immense power within the nonprofit sector. And by weaving in these trauma-informed principles into our organizations, into the way that we work with the people within our organization, into our narratives, we not only communicate better our message and what we're doing, but we engage donors better, but we also honor the experiences and the dignity of those we serve. So thank you so much for your insights today. And for those who are wanting to learn more from you, where can they find you?
So my last name is Bryan, so mariabryan.com, and you can learn about my work and my training and speaking, and my podcast, When Bearing Witness, wherever you binge podcasts, is my journey into becoming a trauma-informed storyteller. And I just have to say that DonorBox has been such an advocate of trauma-informed storytelling in my work and amplifying it and supporting it in so many ways. So thank you for having me here. Thank you for this platform to talk about something that's a little messy.
And thank you for joining us on the Nonprofit Podcast. I hope that you've left with the confidence to take a small step today that will make a big difference tomorrow. Be sure to click the download button on your podcast player, then leave the Nonprofit Podcast a review, or give it a thumbs up if you're listening to the Nonprofit Podcast on YouTube. Your review is a great way to help others find us. You're here to help others. We're here to help you. Until next time, stay inspired.
That warm feeling when you help someone, it's not just happiness, it's fulfillment. And we believe it should be available to everyone, from frontline heroes to first-time fundraisers. Our tools empower you to help others. This is our mission. This is DonorBox, helping you help others.